Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. Today we're going to study Job 20 and learn how to refute health and wealth theology. Job 20 tells us there was a man named Zophar who believed the wicked never prosper and that suffering is caused by sin. If he was correct, then the ramifications for us are that suffering in our culture, such as cancer, disease, murder, terror, poverty, and unemployment, are the result of sin. As we study Job today, we're going to see that Job's life refutes health and wealth theology. Furthermore, we're also going to look at two passages in the New Testament in which Jesus refuted health and wealth theology. Let's start by looking at how the book of Job fits into the overall story of the Bible. Now, this is a table of contents of the Bible. The Bible is divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament. The first 17 books of the Old Testament tell the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible starts at the beginning of time, around 4000 BC, and goes up through about 400 BC. The rest of the books of the Old Testament, from Job through to the end, are various books of poetry, books of prophecy, and other types of books that were written during the time period covered by the first 17 books of the Bible. The book of Job is the 18th book, and it is a book of poetry. We don't know exactly when the book of Job was written. It was probably written around 2000 BC, which was very early in the story of the Bible during the time period covered by the book of Genesis. Now let's take a look at the story of Job. At the beginning of the story of Job, Job was healthy, wealthy, and wise. And he was also a righteous man. And then there was a dialogue between God and Satan up in heaven. And God bragged about Job, telling Satan how Job was very righteous. And Satan responded by saying that the only reason Job followed God was because Job was wealthy. In other words, God had paid Job off. So God gave Satan permission to test Job. So Satan went out, and it's recorded very early in Job. Satan went out and destroyed all of Job's possessions. He killed all of Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And so Job was in a lot of pain. Now, Job did not curse God, even though Job had lost everything and lost his health. But meanwhile, Job did not know why all the suffering had happened. And after he was in pain, three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came to visit Job to comfort him because they had heard everything that had happened to him. And once they were there was a long discussion between Job and his friends. Job spoke first, then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, and that pattern continued. And then at the end, a man named Elihu spoke, and then at the end, Yahweh spoke, and at the very end, Yahweh restored Job's health, wealth, and his family. The general gist of this whole discussion was basically the friends tried to tell Job he was suffering because he had sinned. Job kept insisting that he was innocent, and instead Job kept insisting that he was suffering because for some reason God was against him or had it in for him or was being unfair or something like that. So that's the general gist of this discussion. What we're going to look at today is Job chapter 20, represented by this box here. And again, this was Zophar speaking, and basically Zophar was trying to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned, and the way Zophar did that was to insist that the wicked never prosper, and that even if they do prosper, their prosperity is short-lived and momentary. Now, in order to understand this passage, it helps to understand a little bit about Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is different than English poetry. English poetry is all about rhyme. For example, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. Hebrew poetry is all about rhyme. English poetry is all about rhyme. Hebrew poetry is about repetition, addition, and contrast. In repetition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the same thing in different ways. And part of the art of Hebrew poetry is to see how many different ways you can say the same thing. In addition, a Hebrew poet will make a statement and then add something to it. And in contrast, a Hebrew poet will make a statement and then state the opposite. So with that as a background, let's get started with Job chapter 20, and this is verse 1. Then Zophar the Naamathite answered. Now notice the word answered. As I said, this was part of a long dialogue between Job and his friends. In the previous chapter, in Job 19, Job had said that the reason he was suffering was because God was treating him unfairly. And at one point, Job had also insinuated that his friends were bringing judgment upon themselves because they were criticizing Job and saying that he was suffering because he had sinned. And so Zophar in chapter 20 is responding to what Job had said in chapter 19. Verse 2. And again, this is Zophar speaking. Therefore, my disquieting thoughts make me respond, even because of my inward agitation. I listen to the reproof which insults me, and the spirit of my understanding makes me answer. Now, notice the words disquieting, agitation, reproof, and insults. What this tells us is Zophar was upset at Job. He had been agitated, and the reason he was agitated because he felt he had been insulted and reproved by Job when Job spoke in chapter 19. Verse 3. Again, this is Zophar speaking. Do you know this from of old, from the establishment of man on earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless momentary? Now again, Zophar is speaking. The pronoun you refers to Job, so Zophar is speaking to Job. And the pronoun this refers to verse 5. So basically Zophar said, Job, do you know that the triumphing of the wicked is short? And notice the word from of old, and from the establishment of man on earth. Basically, Zophar was saying that this statement, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, Zophar said that statement had been true since the beginning of time, since the establishment of man on earth. And then notice the word short and the word momentary. Zophar's statement here is basically the triumphing of the wicked is short. In other words, if the wicked do prosper at all, that time of prosperity is very short, or he also uses the term momentary. Now, since this is Hebrew poetry, a lot of times a Hebrew poem can be summarized in one or two verses. These two verses here summarize everything Zophar said in this chapter. Basically, Zophar said that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. And what we're going to see in the rest of the chapter is Zophar keeps saying that same thing, he just says it in different ways. So let's go on to verse 6. And again, this is Zophar speaking. Though the wicked's loftiness reaches the heavens and his head touches the clouds, he perishes forever like his refuse. Those who have seen him will say, where is he? Now the word loftiness and the word clouds indicates prosperity. So Zophar is saying, well, even if the wicked has a little bit of prosperity, then there's the word perishes. The wicked perishes forever. So again, it's this idea, verse 6, there's a contrast here. Verse 6 is, yeah, even though the wicked may prosper, then the contrast in verse 7 is really the wicked are going to perish forever. And again, that fits in with that theme we saw in verse 4 and 5. The prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. Verse 8. The wicked flies away like a dream and they cannot find him. Even like a vision of the night, he is chased away. Notice the word dream and the word vision. Here Zophar compares the wicked to a dream. Just like a dream, in the middle of the night you have a dream, and by morning you've more or less forgotten it, and the memory of it just fades away. Zophar is saying that's what the wicked is like. Even though they may prosper for a short time, their prosperity is going to just kind of fade away, just like a dream, and the memory of a dream fades away. Verse 9. The eye which saw the wicked sees him no longer, and his place no longer beholds him. The wicked's sons favor the poor, and his hands give back his wealth. His bones are full of his youthful vigor, but it lies down with him in the dust. Notice the word youthful, and this phrase lies down with him in the dust. I believe that's a reference to death. So I think here Zophar is saying that the wicked is going to die young. Again, fitting the theme that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. Verse 12. Though evil is sweet in his mouth, and he hides it under his tongue, though he desires evil and will not let it go, but holds it in his mouth, yet, now let me just pause there. Notice the word sweet. Here Zophar compares wickedness to something that is sweet. A wicked person thinks evil is sweet and will hide it in his mouth. And then you have the word yet. Zophar draws a contrast here, and let's scroll down and read this. Yet the wicked's food in his stomach is changed to the venom of cobras within him. So again, in Hebrew poetry, one of the techniques is contrast. We have the statement here that, Zophar said that the wicked thinks that evil is sweet, yet in the end, that food really becomes venom, which is basically saying that the wickedness and the evil becomes poison within him. Verse 15. The wicked swallows riches, but will vomit them up. God will expel them from his belly. The wicked sucks the poison of cobras. The viper's tongue slays him. The wicked does not look at the streams, the waters flowing with honey and curds. The wicked returns what he has attained and cannot swallow it. As to the riches of his trading, he cannot even enjoy them. Notice the word riches and the word cannot. Here Zophar is saying the wicked may accumulate riches through trading, however, he cannot enjoy them. Again, fitting the theme that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. The wicked may accumulate some riches, but it's going to be short and momentary, and he's not going to be able to enjoy them. Verse 19. For the wicked has oppressed and forsaken the poor. He has seized a house which he has not built. Notice the word for. The word for indicates that this verse is the reason, this is the explanation for why the prosperity of the wicked is short. Basically, there's two ideas here. The wicked has oppressed and forsaken the poor. That's one reason that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. The second idea, the wicked has seized a house which he has not built. Again, that idea of seizing a house is something that's wrong. And it's because of these two reasons that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. Verse 20. Because the wicked knew no quiet within him, he does not retain anything he desires. Nothing remains for him to devour, therefore his prosperity does not endure. Again, along with Hebrew poetry, this is just a different way of saying that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary. Verse 22. In the fullness of his plenty, the wicked will be cramped. The hand of everyone who suffers will come against him. Here, notice the phrase, the hand of everyone. Here, Zophar is saying that a lot of people are going to be against the wicked. Verse 23. When the wicked fills his belly, God will send his fierce anger on him and will rain it on him while he is eating. So here, notice the word God. In this verse, Zophar is saying God is the one who's going to be against the wicked. Verse 24. The wicked may flee from the iron weapon, but the bronze bow will pierce him. The bronze bow is drawn forth and comes out of his back, even the glittering point from his gall. Terrors come upon him. Complete darkness is held in reserve for his treasures, and unfanned fire will devour him. It will consume the survivor in his tent. The heavens will reveal his iniquity, and the earth will rise up against him. The increase of his house will depart. His possessions will flow away in the day of his anger. This is the wicked man's portion from God, even the heritage decreed to him by God. Notice the word this, the pronoun this. The pronoun this refers to everything that Zophar had said in the previous verses about the wicked. And notice the word from God and the word decreed by God. Here Zophar is saying that everything that he had said in the previous verses, all the bad things that happen to wicked people, here he's saying that that is from God. The fact that the prosperity of the wicked is short and momentary, that is from God, and it is decreed by God. And that's the last verse of Zophar's speech in Job chapter 20. Now, if we summarize what Zophar was saying, let's first think about what was Zophar's objective. Remember, there was this dialogue between Job and his friends. Job's friends were trying to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. They were trying to convince Job that he had lost all of his wealth, he had lost his family, and he had lost his health because he had sinned. And so that's what Zophar was trying to convince Job of in this passage. And so Zophar's theme throughout this was that the wicked never prosper, and that if the wicked do prosper, it's only short and momentary. And so the conclusion there is that Zophar believed that suffering is caused by sin. If the wicked never prosper, and if Zophar is telling Job this when they're trying to convince Job that he was suffering because of sin, then the conclusion is Zophar believed that suffering is caused by sin, and he was trying to convince Job that his suffering was caused by sin. Now let's see what Jesus had to say about this. This is a passage from Luke chapter 13. Now on the same occasion there were some present who reported to Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Notice the word blood. This indicates that Pilate had killed some of the Galileans. Verse 2, Jesus said to them, "Do you suppose that these Galileans were greater sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered this fate?" Now notice here, Jesus asked the health and wealth question very directly. Jesus said, "Do you suppose that these Galileans were greater sinners?" In other words, do you believe the Galileans were killed because of sin? The answer is in verse 3. Jesus said, "I tell you, no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." So here, Jesus answered his own question. His answer clearly was no. The Galileans had not been killed because of sin. Verse 4. "Do you suppose that those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them were worse culprits than all the men who live in Jerusalem?" Now here, Jesus refers to a different calamity. 18 were killed by a tower in Siloam. But again, Jesus asked very bluntly the health and wealth question. Do you believe these 18 were killed because of sin? In this case, Jesus uses the phrase or the term worse culprits. Were these 18 worse culprits, worse sinners than all the other men in Jerusalem? And Jesus answers this in verse 5. "I tell you, no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." So here's a second occasion where Jesus clearly said, no, these people were not killed because of sin. Now let's go over to John chapter 9. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Now notice the word man. This tells us we're talking about a mature person, not a child. And notice he was blind from birth. So if he's a mature man and he was blind from birth, this means he's been blind for a very long time. Verse 2. The disciples of Jesus asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Now, notice the assumption here. The disciples assumed that this blindness was caused by sin. And so they asked, who sinned? They wanted to know, did the man himself sin and cause his blindness, or did his parents sin and cause him to be blind from birth? Verse 3, Jesus answered, "It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him." So notice the word neither. Again, Jesus said very clearly that the suffering or the blindness was not caused by sin. But notice also, Jesus gave an alternative explanation for the suffering. Jesus said the man was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now think of this way. When Jesus was here on earth, he performed miracles and he healed people in order to prove his deity. But in order to do that, there had to be people around who needed to be healed. And so Jesus' point here is that the reason this man was born blind was so that he would be there, so that Jesus could come along and heal him. And so the blindness was not caused by sin. Instead, the blindness was just so Jesus could come along and heal him and display the works of God through this man and give Jesus an opportunity to prove his deity. So, how do we refute health and wealth theology? Well, first, Job's life refutes it. Job 1:1 tells us Job was blameless and upright, but he lost all his possessions, his children, and his health. Job lost everything because he was a casualty of a battle between Yahweh and Satan. Job lost everything because God was trying to make a point to Satan. Job's righteousness did not protect him from catastrophe, and Job's righteousness did not guarantee him a prosperous and healthy existence. Second, Jesus refuted health and wealth theology. Jesus mentioned the Galileans who were killed by Pilate, the 18 who were killed by the tower in Siloam, and the man born blind. Jesus said none of this death or suffering was the result of sin. Therefore, there is not a correlation between righteousness and prosperity. Righteousness does not guarantee health and wealth, and wickedness does not guarantee suffering. When we suffer, or when we see other people suffering, we should not assume they are suffering because of sin. Third, God's agenda refutes health and wealth theology. Job suffered because Yahweh was trying to make a point to Satan. The man born blind was blind so that Jesus could come along and heal him and prove his deity. The lesson for us is that sometimes suffering occurs so that God can accomplish his agenda. So when we are faced with suffering in our lives or our society, such as cancer, disease, murder, terror, poverty, or unemployment, let's consider that perhaps the only reason for the suffering is so that God can accomplish his agenda. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription, and your email will not be sold or given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. Finally, and once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.